I would just like to talk about intermittent fasting and fat loss because especially these days, a lot of people were jumping in the bandwagon of, doing intermittent fasting and without truly understanding how it works. So, intermittent fasting, unlike what many people believe, it's not really a fat loss per se. As a matter of fact, intermittent fasting doesn't necessarily lead to fat loss. So, intermittent fasting is not a diet either. So, intermittent fasting in reality is actually an eating pattern. So, just like for typical, people, we eat like 3 times a day. When we sleep at night, we sleep, let's say, for 8 hours. So for normal people, let's take an example. Somebody who wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning and goes to bed at 10 o'clock at night. So by the time we sleep, it's actually, we undergo through fasting mode, because the complete gastric emptying, meaning to say, there's no more food in the stomach, takes about 4 to 6 hours depending on the meal composition. So, for example, the meal that last we've eaten is higher in fat. Since fat slows down gastric emptying, obviously it's gonna take longer for the meal to be digested before we go through fasting mode. Anyway, back to intermittent fasting. There are several ways to set up an intermittent fasting. There's the 16-8 approach, which was originally popularized by Martin Burkhan of leangains.com. There's also the Eat Stop Eat by Brad Pillon, where you're supposed to do alternate day fasting. But in reality, if you really want to maximize the results of your intermittent fasting, especially if your goal is fat loss, is to also focus and concentrate on your macronutrient composition. Again, intermittent fasting has no magical benefits when it comes to fat loss. I'm not making this video to talk, shit about intermittent fasting, because I've been personally using intermittent fasting since 2010 or 2011 or so. Anyway, I've been using it for so many years because the primary reasons why I choose to do intermittent fasting is because, first of all, I do well with intermittent fasting. It makes me more compliant to my macronutrient ratio. Plus, it is so convenient because since I work night shift, I work 7 p.m. to 7 in the morning. I pretty much just fast the entire shift. So, it keeps me more awake, keeps me more energetic while I'm in my work. And the other thing is, since my calorie budget is not that much to begin with, it makes it easier for me to comply to small calorie budget. But anyway, yes, a lot of people were jumping into the intermittent fasting bandwagon lately without truly understanding how it works. So, there's, like what I said, there's really no magical benefit to intermittent fasting. Although in my personal anecdote, intermittent fasting, first of all, it's convenient. It makes it easier for people to comply to their allotted macronutrient budget, especially if it's not much to begin with. For example, if somebody, a smaller individual, a lighter individual, has, let's say, 1,500 calorie budget to begin with, it's gonna be easier for him or her to comply to that allotted macronutrient budget, given that, let's say he or she is just eating two to three meals per day. Because what really happens in reality is that when people start to do intermittent fasting, let's use the 16-8 intermittent fasting for as an example. So once people cut down the feeding window, it becomes like a no-brainer approach for, as a no-brainer, calorie restriction. But in reality, it's not really the intermittent fasting that caused the fat loss, but simply because they were they started eating fewer calories than they normally did before. So that's how they lose weight. But again, like what I said, there's really no magical benefits to it. Although again, in my personal experience, doing intermittent fasting seems to have like a slight advantage to calorie partitioning, at least in my experience, because I work at nights. I fast when I'm at work, so I do a lot of walking. If you look at the physiological standpoint of it, I mean, when you're fasting, your body taps on stored body fat, and it kind of depletes the muscle and liver glycogen slightly, though. I mean, not completely, by doing meat, by doing activities outside the gym. So I'm talking about walking specifically. And then so when we're fasting, our the hormone called the catecholamines, it is so high in the bloodstream. So it's making it easier for us to mobilize those stored body fat, and it gets burned in the muscle. So that's the physiological reasoning behind how intermittent fasting work, if you actually look at the science behind it. But again, fat loss occurs if there's a calorie deficit. So intermittent fasting won't necessarily work when there's no presence of calorie deficit, because the primary primary reason why we lose weight is because there's a presence of calorie deficit. I mean, that calorie deficit can either be taken on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. But again, I just wanted to point out that intermittent fasting is not like some kind of magical approach that is gonna make somebody ripped. I mean, if somebody does well on intermittent fasting, then do intermittent fasting approach. But you have to focus on your macronutrient proportion as well. And obviously you have to do to consistently do weight training for your body to preserve the muscle mass, because look around you. A lot of people were probably gonna say, I did intermittent fasting and I've lost some weight. Okay, granted, I know, I believe you. I'm not trying to argue with you that it's not gonna work, but these people normally has, first of all, a lot of weight to lose to begin with, and they're just probably not aware, or they're in denial that the reason why they've lost weight is not because of the intermittent fasting, but because they've created a calorie deficit without them realizing it, that it's actually the calorie deficit, because ever since they started doing the intermittent fasting, they didn't realize that they were actually eating fewer calories than they used to. So that's how they lose weight. But again, I'm not saying anything bad about intermittent fasting. I personally use it. It's just I created this video to actually make people aware on how it really works.